Hello, everyone, and welcome to part one of our lecture on Chapter 4 Quantitative Designs. So, throughout this week of our lecture, we're going to be focusing heavily on quantitative designs. And to start, I really want to go into what it means to be doing quantitative research and how this falls into the general categorization of all research studies. Because when you are designing a study, there are decisions that you have to make in order for you to determine what type of study you want to do, where it falls in the categorization of research studies. Is it more quantitative? Is it more qualitative? Is it mixed methods? And there are a set of three questions that really helps us to determine what type of study we're designing. The first of those is when we ask ourselves if we are trying to visualize or conceptualize the study. We also have to ask ourselves what the practical details of our study are going to be. And we also have to learn about any possible errors that could occur in our study, whether that be errors with our participants, errors with ourselves as researchers, or errors in the statistical data gathering process, whatever that is. Only once we start asking these questions can we really get a feel for and begin working in our study. So, going into a little bit more detail, the first characteristic of research design involves asking the what question. What are we trying to accomplish in this study? And there are a few different ways that we can answer that question. We might be exploring a new relationship between variables. We could also be describing a phenomenon in greater detail than what is currently available. We could also be trying to explain an established relationship between things, between variables or things in our world. And by asking these questions, we are trying to answer the what our study is about, what we're trying to accomplish with our study. And common distinctions of studies are based on trying to explore, describe, or explain something. So we see how each of these questions almost relates to different categories of research, depending on whether or not we are trying to explore, describe, or explain something. So, one of the common distinctions in the categorization of research studies is quantitative versus qualitative studies. And quantitative studies are the ones that involve large samples of participants with clean measures that we have established to test our hypotheses. And most often, we are testing an established theory. So there is already a theory about what is going on, and we are taking a large swath of people and we are going to test that hypothesis in this large sample. And we call it clean measures because we're saying that there are these established scales or assessments that we are going to use to test that hypothesis. As we've already mentioned, with quantitative studies, there is a large focus on the intensive design of the study. You spend a considerable amount of time in preparation of actually engaging in your study, just setting it up, having your procedure set in place, exactly establishing the methods that you're going to use, the measures that will be included, as well as determining how you are going to handle potential problems in the data. There's this intensive design work, and then there's less focus on the data analysis because the data will be analyzed in the way that you have already set it up to be that way. You've already specified what analyses you want to run before you ever start collecting data. So when you run data, it's already ready to go and you don't have to spend as much time doing it. A lot of times when we talk about quantitative studies, we say that there's a large amount of statistical analyses that are involved. You're able to use more advanced, complex analyses to understand and explain the information that you're trying to explore. The other half of this equation is our qualitative studies. And qualitative studies are conducted with very small samples of participants. Instead of having this big group of people that you're trying to test a hypothesis, you have a very small sample and you are looking for an in-depth exploration of some phenomena that you want to see if it's there. A lot of times, qualitative studies are used to construct a new theory. This is where we get an idea of, like, hey, there might be something going on in this population. I'm going to go investigate it with this small sample. And if my results, if these people say yes, then we can say that this thing occurs. This theory, this hypothesis is accurate. And then a quantitative study can come out and say, now I'm going to explore and I'm going to test this in a larger sample. Work in qualitative studies has a much heavier focus on data analysis because there's much less design work. Specifically, you don't go into a qualitative study with very specific guidelines of what you're going to be doing, how you're going to be collecting data, but rather you go into it as an exploration of, I'm going to pivot during data collection as needed. I'm going to go until I reach saturation, which we'll talk more about when we get to qualitative studies, but there's less design work. So then the larger part of the study becomes analyzing the data, looking for patterns, trying to draw these conclusions, these sort of summaries of what you're seeing based on what you saw during data collection. And where quantitative studies focus more heavily on more advanced statistical analyses, qualitative studies focus more on text, audio, images, and object analyses. So allowing your visual learning to take place because there isn't a large analysis that you can run on a small sample. Instead, you have these maybe images that will represent as much of your data as possible in a smaller way. So we have these sort of categorizations of research, and really we're talking about exploratory studies in some of these cases. And to answer or to understand exploratory studies, they are often used to investigate a new topic of research. They are trying to look for a new thread of previously established relationships, a new methodology, maybe a new instrument of data collection, or to even just gain a deeper understanding on a specific topic. They are trying to answer the what question. A lot of times, the exploratory studies are used as initiators for our larger, more complex studies because they aim at investigating, exploring, and figuring out a new innovative thread of knowledge. And when we're talking about exploratory studies, they can be both quantitative and qualitative. So exploratory studies can serve in both sort of categorizations of research methods, depending on the researcher and the topic that's being explored. A second categorization of research that is almost like this overarching theme that's going to be similar to exploratory studies is the descriptive studies. And descriptive studies are really trying to answer our how questions, how something is happening. And they work by allowing researchers to focus on describing a phenomenon or understanding the details about people's experiences of a particular event. So a lot of times with descriptive studies, we are focusing on how much we can understand how something is occurring in a population, how it came to be. And an imperative part of engaging in a descriptive study is having an awareness of the difficulties that a specific group of people is experiencing, because that may reveal possible ways of intervening in the group that you are looking at that might be in need. And generally, qualitative studies are often necessary to gather in-depth data and allow participants the flexibility of expressing those feelings and situations in detail. So when we talk about descriptive studies, they're generally qualitative because you are really needing that in-depth description of how something is occurring, and you don't get that in quantitative data. So descriptive studies tend to be more qualitative. And we also have explanatory studies, and these are what we call reinforcing studies because they answer the why questions. They really focus on explaining the reasons behind a phenomenon, a relationship, or event, understanding why this occurred. And a lot of times, explanatory studies seek to explain the reasons behind an already known or established relationship, likely that has been established from another study, maybe even a qualitative study. And now it's going in and describing why this occurs, why it keeps happening. The research that is done in the explanatory field can be quantitative or qualitative depending on the researcher, but generally, explanatory studies tend to be more quantitative because you have more power to support your answers to that why question. So, this sort of sets the stage for us in some general categories of research methods and research studies. But we can go even deeper because we can also break studies down into cross-sectional and longitudinal study designs. And if we're going to start, let's go into some cross-sectional studies here. So cross-sectional is the name for a study that collects data only once. And it's a simple snapshot of data collected at one point in time. So an example of this could be if you are collecting information on participants who have purchased an expensive car in the last year. You are only interviewing each participant one time. You're maybe meeting them at the dealership or wherever they buy their car, but you're only collecting data from each participant one time. As a researcher, you might do multiple days of data collection, like you might have 10 participants on one day and 8 on another and 0 on the next day. But that still counts as one data collection because you are only collecting data from the participant themselves one time. So oftentimes, cross-sectional research refers to a one shot of data collection without any follow-up questions. Anything that would be necessary for you to contact the participant again is completely eliminated from this study. Cross-sectional research, cross-sectional studies are particularly useful when you are collecting data from a large number of participants. It's really nice because you don't have to follow up with them. So you don't have to try to manage this form of communication long term. So you can get a large amount of people and collect data from them each once and then move on. The downside to cross-sectional research is that it is difficult to establish any cause and effect relationship because all of the variables are collected at the same time. So as a researcher, we don't have this time component that says one thing occurred before the other, and because that thing occurred before the other, we can say that it caused the other. We don't get that in cross-sectional research because all of it is collected at the same time. Which leads us into our longitudinal studies. So longitudinal studies collect data at different points in time, which can then help the data to be more accurate and to avoid and minimize errors like inaccurate responses. So in longitudinal data, you are following up with your participants. You might have one wave of data collection and then you meet with them again and you collect data again. And then you meet with them a third time and you collect data again. Maybe it's across the time span of a year. And the reason why this minimizes errors is because you have multiple chances to get the clients or the participants' responses on measures. You can look for change over time. Maybe they responded to questions on day 1 of data collection incorrectly. They read a question incorrectly. But on day 2 and day 3, they tell you, hey, I read this question wrong, and you see their answers change. So it minimizes those errors. A good example of longitudinal research, maybe if you want to know the long-term effects of a specific medication given to children. You might start with interviewing the parents of those children on the day that they start taking the medication. And then you're going to measure them at month 1, and then at month 3, and then again at month 6. And each time that you are collecting data from those participants, we call that a wave. So you might have multiple waves that will establish how the person is changing over time. Sometimes researchers will start with base wave, which can sometimes also just be called wave one, where you're getting a baseline for all of your clients. And then each time that they come in for another set of data collection, you call it wave two, wave three, wave four, and so on until you reach however many waves are in your study, because it varies from study to study. And longitudinal research is really desirable for a lot of topics because they're known to be extremely accurate. You also get this added component of causality, which is one of the additional benefits of longitudinal studies. But under the umbrella of longitudinal studies, we also have various types of studies that are all considered longitudinal. The first of those is a panel study. And a panel study follows and accumulates data from the same participants over a period of time. So the people that you recruit on day one for your base wave or wave one of data collection, you contact those exact same people at wave two, at wave three, wave four, until you reach the end of your study. So it's the same people every time. We also have trend studies. And trend studies collect data at different points in time from different participants in the same population. The key with trend data is that trend studies is that there is some variable of interest that is the same for all participants across each wave of data collection. So an example that our book goes into is if you are doing a study that's looking at the attitudes on breastfeeding. You might have different waves of data collection that every participant is similar or shares one common variable of interest. They are a breastfeeding parent. And you might collect data through various waves, but that variable will remain consistent. But you only recruit participants who are breastfeeding parents. And then you collect data multiple times. So you might collect data in 1990, again in 1995, again in 2000, 2005, so on and so forth, so that you can look for trends in the data. So these participants have some shared variable of interest, but they are different people from wave one to wave two to wave three and so on. And we also have cohort studies, which follow the same cohort of people over time, but includes a much broader definition of cohort. Because this could be anyone who's born at the same time as one another, anyone who has been through a similar experience, or has been married or given birth at the same year, whatever the cohort is can be defined by the researcher. And then each wave of data collection is not the same person. So it's a different set of people from that same cohort. So unlike panel studies, in cohort studies, you're not following the same participants multiple times. And unlike trend studies, the participants in a cohort study do not share a characteristic or a variable at the time that they participate in the study. They are all just gathered because they are of some interest to the researcher at that time. So whether that means I'm interested in graduate students, or I'm interested in whatever it is, something that creates this cohort of people, and then you collect data from multiple people within that cohort. So as you can tell, trend and cohort studies are pretty similar, and these are just terms to help you distinguish how we can break down longitudinal studies. So that is where we are going to end our part 1 lecture on chapter 4. Join me for the next part of our lecture where we're going to continue talking about some qualities of quantitative studies. I will see you all in the next lecture.